Many of you are perhaps, first of all, surprised by the title of my lecture. As we all know, Georgia O'Keeffe is never grouped, never identified as an abstract expressionist. Whoops, where does that go? Let's have the title. Never identified as an abstract expressionist. And surely she is not an abstract well, so this one isn't working. This one isn't working. I will just use this and I will. No, that's not working. Is this what's? Do I have to do this? That won't be good. They're fiddling in the back. How's that? That's good. Okay. I'll try not to touch anything else. Okay. Title, Abstract Expressionist. Many of you should be surprised. She's not considered an abstract expressionist. And I'm using the words in a very special term, and I'm hoping to convince you by the end of the day that she is, in a special sense, using language precisely, that she is an abstract expressionist. Not a member of the so-called abstract expressionists, but nonetheless somebody for whom this label is perfectly appropriate. What I had planned to do today was to, and as advertised, was to give you a broad overview of her career and set it into the context of American art as a complement to the earlier lectures that we've heard. The last lecture changed my mind on that. I missed the first lecture. The Will South lecture was given the week of the Great Flood. And on the Friday of his lecture, I was literally pulling ductwork out from under my home. So I missed that lecture. I was in attendance for the second lecture by Cody Hartley. And what he had to say changed my mind for what I want to do today. As you remember, Mr. Hartley had a thesis, and the thesis was that the shapes found in her earliest work produced here in Columbia are precisely the same shapes that recur over and over and over again in her art from that point on. And it was a very sharp and very useful observation. Now, his point in making that observation related to the thesis of this exhibition, which is that her experience here, her time here, was crucial for her work. What he did not do was to pursue that observation. What are the larger implications of that? What does it mean that the shapes she's using here are the same shapes she's using there? So what I want to do today is to build on that, to enlarge that observation, and to deepen it. What does it mean? As a way of beginning, it is a useful generalization that there are, in fact, two kinds of modern artists, and I say modern for reasons that I won't go into, but in terms of modern artists, we can generally divide artists into two kinds. Those who paint what they like or what they need, and in this category, I would put people like Mondrian, who clearly very much liked order and wanted to implement order in the world, or people like Warhol, who liked beautiful movie stars, male movie stars. On the other hand, we have those who paint themselves. They're painting, they're really producing self-portraits, okay? And in this category, I would put people like Hopper, and I think it can be argued that that man having coffee in the night cafes is really Hopper. Or people like de Kooning, the abstract expressionist, the most famous of the gesturalist expression, who is constantly recording exactly who he is at a particular moment in time. Here we see him in his alcoholic stage in the mid-1950s. Now, again, it's a generalization, and like all generalizations, it has its faults. It can't be used everywhere. It doesn't apply to everything. It's a tool, and like all tools, it has its uses. You can't use the hammer everywhere, but when you need a hammer, you need a hammer. And what I want to argue is that it's a very useful for the job at hand. And the job at hand is to talk about Georgia O'Keeffe and what she is painting. Is she painting her taste, or is she painting herself? And that is the question that I want to pursue in this lecture. Now, I will be pursuing that in the context of what I had agreed to do here, which is to establish her work in context, to see her work from the beginning to the end and how it fits into American art. And in general, that story begins with the International Exhibition of Modern Art in 1913, the so-called Armory Show. In general, she is seen in the context of that exhibition, which was a watershed moment in the history of American art. It was the moment when America as a whole got introduced to developments in avant-garde art going on in Europe at that time. Now, there were about 1,200 works in the show. 2/3 of them were American works. Only 1/3 of them were European. And most of the European works were quite familiar. Even in this picture, you can see that most of the works were figural and came as no great surprise. There were works in the show, however, that were literally shocking to the American public. Two of the most shocking works in the show are these two. Nude Descending a Staircase by Duchamp, which the American public had no way to figure out what was going on. They tried to, they called it Explosion in a Shingle Factory. They called it Rude Descending a Staircase. They just could not fathom it at all. It was literally shocking. The mysterious. Infuriating, on the other hand, was the Matisse. About half of the show went on to Chicago. And when it was shown in Chicago, the students at the Art Institute hung Matisse in effigy. They were so, Matisse, our lovable dear Matisse, how could you do that? Anyway, they were shocked by this painting, okay? Now, both of these paintings can be related to a development called Expressionism. And it was this tradition, this is one of the things that comes out of the show. There are two fundamental strains of art, American art, that develop that as a result of the Armory Show. And one of them is Expressionism. And I need to be very clear here and give you a definition. Expressionism is the alteration/manipulation of the formal elements of art to capture and convey the feelings of the artist, okay? Now, on the one hand, John Marin is a representational abstractionist, expressionist. On the other hand, we have de Kooning. Both of these are artists who are expressing themselves, expressing their own feelings through art, okay? We're not looking at the subject, we're looking at the artist. Now, the word abstract is and this is a word that we're going to be looking at a lot today. What does the word mean? This is a word that has a variety of different meanings, and I have to say that many people in my field tend to use it in a very sloppy way, and I always object to that. In this case, the word abstract, when it's applied to de Kooning, simply means non-representational. And that is one perfectly fine definition of abstract. And this abstract expressionism. Now, the other current that comes out of this exhibition is evident in the little head over here. This is a piece of sculpture by Brancusi. It's called Mademoiselle Pogany, and it is abstraction in a very different sense. This is an abstraction in the literal sense of the word, to abstract, to simplify a subject to its essence. And that's what he's done here. He has taken Mademoiselle Pogany and he's reduced her to an essence of what he considered to be her beauty. Now, Brancusi's most famous abstraction, as many of you know, is the bird in flight, in which he's taken a bird and whittled it down to the essential qualities of flight, of swift movement through the air. Now, this is the tradition in which we generally locate O'Keeffe. She is generally considered an abstraction artist, an artist working in abstraction in that particular sense. An artist who takes a subject, simplifies it to its essence, as you can see here in this work on the right. It's a tradition most identified in the period after the Armory show with Dove, Arthur Dove, her close friend, and O'Keeffe. And the influence of Brancusi is, I think, very apparent in the black bird that we have in this particular work. I should also mention this is the work, I will probably not be coming back to that later. This is the work that she produced at the death of Stieglitz, her husband. And it's a work to commemorate his death. All right. The locating her in that general tradition is accurate, but it's oversimplified in two ways. It misses two things. In the first place, as far as we know, Georgia O'Keeffe herself never saw the Armory show, which is not to say that she wasn't deeply influenced by it. But the influences in her work were not from the Armory show. The influences in her work came, as we'll see, elsewhere. And it also misses, I think, something really essential in her work about what she's doing in her work. She produces these beautiful abstractions, but there's more to the story, and I think it's that more that is really important. Now, in terms of her career, she was, as many of you know, born in Wisconsin, and between 1905 and 1907, she was a student at the Art Institute of Chicago. In 1908, she moves to New York, where she studies at the Art Students League with a very well-known painter in the period, a very, very famous painter of the period. And during that year, she produces this work, which wins a prize. This is a prize-winning work. It wins a prize for still life. Shortly after this year, however, she gives up painting for 4 years. And she gives up painting because she's so dissatisfied, not with this particular painting, but with this kind of art. She's very dissatisfied with art that is just imitation, that is just concerned with textures, and she finds that it simply does not suit her. And so for 4 years, she gives up painting. She goes back to college. She goes to teachers' college and becomes a teacher. And it's not until 1912 that she returns to painting. And she does so on the basis of the influence of this man. This is Arthur Wesley Dow, who was a teacher at the Columbia University Teachers College. In 1912, she's taking a summer class in Virginia when she gets introduced to the ideas of this man. In 1914, she actually goes and studies with him in New York at the other Columbia. At Columbia University. And his ideas, what he teaches is a more musical conception of what art ought to be. What he teaches is that what matters is the arrangement of shapes and forms. What matters is taking liberties with shapes and forms in order to express a more musical conception of art. So it frees her up from the representational, the imitation notion of art. And what she said later was this. She said, I think it was Arthur Dow who affected my start, who helped me find something of my own. What's interesting about the statement, of course, is that it's, I think, it is not a very definite statement. It's not a very powerful statement of his influence. What it really says is that he gave me a start. And okay, he gave me a start. He gave me a start with the musical conception. Now, his notion of art as music was not a new idea. This was a very popular 19th century idea, beginning with the Romantics. It's, of course, most associated with Whistler. Whistler was the artist who most exemplified this in his art. by referring to his works in musical terms as symphonies, as nocturnes, okay? Now, what these guys are doing here, and let's be very clear, and what they are, these are artists of taste. These are artists who are producing works because they like them, because it provides for their needs, for their tastes. The Dow, of course, is a part of a long tradition of 19th century landscape painting, pastoral painting that provides city people with a kind of relief into quietude, into relaxation, as a relief from the growing anxieties and confusions of modern life. Whistler's work comes out not of an objection to the nervous qualities of modern life, but its ugliness. Whistler is working in London, which in the 19th century, as even today, is not the most beautiful of places, okay? But again, artists of taste. Now, the fact that it influences, this musical conception of art influences her later work is very evident in immediately in the works that she produces here at Columbia College in 1915-16, which is to say works like this, which have musical titles. Okay? Now, what she's doing here is arranging shapes and forms in satisfying ways. It could be considered formalism. Now, the word abstract can be used for three very different ways. One, it can be used to simply refer to something non-representational. Two, it can be referred to the process of simplification. Three, it could be used for those works that are more legitimately and more properly called formalist, which is to say an arrangement of shapes and forms that provide aesthetic pleasure for the viewer. And there's no doubt that at one level these are formalist. She finds these shapes and forms attractive. It is also thought, of course, that she may be abstracting in that other sense, that she is being inspired by natural forms. Like so much of the work in this show, done in this period, they're very organic, and in many cases, they do look like abstractions, in that sense, abstractions of nature. This work in the show, for example, Out of My Head, is identified as a possible abstraction in the wall label, which you've all read, I'm sure, is identified as possible abstractions of river water and palm, maybe even palmetto trees, okay? Now, the problem with that, of course, is the title of the work. And the title, of course, is her title, and we need to be very clear always on titles. So one always has to be very careful with titles. You have to know who titled it. When was it titled? And these titles, of course, are the titles. We know these are the titles that she herself gave the works. So when she calls this work Out of My Head, she's making it very clear that this is something that's in her, not necessarily something that she's responding to out there, but she's responding to something in herself. And that's the point, I think. Now, the other major influence that comes, that she experiences at this time, comes by way of Kandinsky. Now, Kandinsky's influence on her is always referred to, but I have to say I have never seen it actually plumbed and understood in the fullest sense. In 1911, Kandinsky wrote a book called On the Spiritual in Art. The book was translated into English in 1914. And shortly after it was published, she purchased a copy of the book, and in 1914 read it twice. It was a very strong influence on her. And the influence on her seemed to be on this notion, Kandinsky's notion of inner necessity. And this is Kandinsky's definition of inner necessity, that every artist, as a creator, has something in him which demands expression. This is the element of personality. That what we're talking about is that what the artist wishes to produce is something that comes from inside, that has to do with personality, that has to do with character, that has to do with identity. And it seems to me, that's what she learned from Kandinsky, that by producing something inside me, that we are in some way producing images of the self, of the inner self. Now, what she said about this later, of course, she was very articulate. Excuse me. She was very articulate about this period in her career and later wrote, "This was one of the best times in my life." She's referring here to her time at Columbia College. "This was one of the best times of my life. There was no one around to look at what I was doing, no one interested, no one to say anything about it, one way or another. I was alone and singularly free, working into my own, unknown. No one to satisfy by myself." So the influence of Columbia was that it had no influence. She was free of all those horrible, horrible influences that you find in New York, okay, at the time. "I began with charcoal and paper and decided not to use any color until it was impossible to do what I wanted to do." So what is interesting is she begins with form. Form is the essence of her aesthetic. Form, not color, but form. Form is essential. "I could see how each painting or drawing had been done according to one teacher or another." And again, here she's referring to the fact that in the past, she was under the influence of others, okay? "And I said to myself, I have things in my head that are not like what anyone has taught me. Shapes and ideas, and these so near me, so natural to my way of being. And the underline is my emphasis. And it seems to me this is central to what we see later developing in her work, that what she's expressing is not nature, not an attraction or anything. She's expressing my way of being. She's expressing in these images who she is, or perhaps who she wants to be, or the incipient qualities of herself. They're all very similar, of course, in terms of their fluidity, their strength, their gracefulness. They are all of a type. All of them, again, coming from, again, inside herself. Now, perhaps inspired by things she's seeing as well. But when she's inspired by something outside of herself, it's because it corresponds to something inside herself, to something in what she would call her being. Out of my head. Now, as many of you know, these drawings are sent to her friend, Pulitzer, and Pulitzer then takes them to Alfred Stieglitz, who is running the 291 Gallery at the time. The 291 Gallery, very famous, even before, as many of you know, even before the Armory show, Americans had been able to see developments in avant-garde European arts, and they were seeing it at the 291 Gallery. Before the Armory show, Stieglitz had shows of Cézanne, Picasso and Braque, even Rodin drawings, watercolors. So she takes these drawings to Stieglitz, who famously says, "At last, a woman on paper," and then proceeds to include them in an exhibition in 1916. And of course, he does so without notifying George O'Keeffe. George O'Keeffe is in New York in 1916, and a friend of hers stops her on the streets and says, "Great show at the 291 Gallery." And she says, "What show at the 291 Gallery?" She promptly goes over there and gives him a piece of her mind. She is not pleased that he has not notified her. She's very pleased with the show, of course, but she is not pleased with it not having been told. She thought it was pretty high-handed, of course. What happens then is she goes back to being a teacher. She moves back to from 1916 to 18. No, what am I saying? She had been. In 1916, she then goes back. Yeah, she does. She goes back to Amarillo, Texas, where she'd been teaching, and for the next 2 years. And for the next 2 years, there's a very, very intense, I don't want to say passionate, but intense correspondence between Stieglitz and O'Keeffe. And at the end of that very intense meeting of the minds, results in Stieglitz inviting her to come to New York, where he says he will support her. Help provide her with a place to live and a studio, and provide her support. She moves to New York, and it's not very long before she is living, but she has provided a bed as well. And here is a picture of her taken shortly after her coming to New York. And this is one of the many photos he took of her between 1918 and 1925. He took over 350 photographs of Georgia O'Keeffe. Many of them focused on her hands, which are, even here in this drawing, rather extraordinary. There is really something extraordinarily strong and graceful in those hands. And I think it is no mistake that these are precisely the qualities that we find in her art. And that is in some ways the thesis of my talk today, that the qualities that she has in her are the qualities that we find in the art itself. Those qualities of strength and grace, extraordinary hands, which are featured in many of the images. He also did, and some of them are again character studies. This extraordinary image of her on the right, taken from around 1920. Again, 1918 to 1925, over 350 prints, not just photographs, but prints made of her work. And many of these are nudes, very erotic nudes, very sexual nudes. In 1921, he has a retrospective exhibition of his work, and in that exhibition there are 146 prints that he shows. 46 of them are of Georgia O'Keeffe. None of them are identified as images of Georgia O'Keeffe, but everyone knew who they were. We didn't have to know who they were. And again, they were something of a sensation. And they really do reveal something, not just about their relationship, I think, but they really do say something about Georgia O'Keeffe herself, that she's willing to not only be the subject of these nudes and subject of these portraits, but to have them exhibited to the public. And it is our very first indication that she was a very sexually liberated woman. And her sexual liberation was very much a part of a development, a social development. One tends to think of women's lib, we tend to think of feminism as something belonging to the 1960s and 1970s, when of course it has a much longer history, and during the 1920s was a very strong developments of that movement, and particularly with regard to the acceptance of the idea, the rejection of the Victorian idea that men like sex, women don't particularly like it, but the rejection of that idea for the acceptance of that idea that women too are sexual beings, and she was herself that and willing to acknowledge that. Now her sexuality was also evident in an exhibition that she had of her work in 1924. And these were the so-called flower paintings. In 1924, she exhibited a huge number of paintings of flowers. Many of them simply very beautiful flowers. These were a series of flowers that she produced as a result of the fact that she found in New York there wasn't in New York not enough nature in New York. And she also felt that people in New York need more nature. She also thought that people don't really look at flowers. We glance at them. And so what she wanted to do was, as she says here, produce things that people would have to notice. So she basically gives us close-ups of flowers. Not flowers in a vase on a table, but close-ups of flowers so we put our nose right into the flower. Now many of these seemed very, very erotic, seemed very, very sexual, seemed to be abstractions, particularly of the female body, and they created quite a sensation. There was a huge critical response to these works. She herself did not like the nature of the response, and she herself said they weren't particularly sexual, and I think it's hard to deny their sexuality. I think the point is that she didn't necessarily like the way they were seen in sexual terms. She didn't like the way men viewed them as the ecstasy of sexual fulfillment, or statements, as one critic say, oh, these are paintings that say I want to have a baby. Clearly they are images of the beauty of female sexuality, the acceptance of it, the beauty of it. Here's one of my favorites. The New Yorker commented that psychiatrists have been sending their female patients up to the O'Keeffe canvases. But in many ways, I think the New Yorker, as the New Yorker usually does, got it right. I mean, this is really about trying to, as an acceptance of female sexuality. Now, sexuality was not her only subject, of course. She was continuing to produce music that were, we want to say formalist, non-representational images, abstract in the sense of non-representational, or images, arrangements of forms and colors that are meant to produce, to produce a musical experience. Okay, works again that came entirely out of my head, not a response to anything in nature, but images out of my head, expressing herself. She was also doing abstractions in the precise use of the term. In particular, she did a wonderful series of abstractions of New York that really very much capture an essence of New York. Like this, its power, its strength, its simplicity in works like this. And about works like this, she said it is only by selection, by elimination, and by emphasis that we get at the real meaning of things. And so there is a concern for abstraction in her works, expressing these are images about New York. She's also doing nature imagery, abstractions like this, Trees in Autumn. And what is interesting, and this is a work in the show, and I show it because it is a work in the show. This is one of the many works that she produced in the Adirondacks. The Stieglitz family had a home in the Adirondacks, and they would spend the summers and falls in every summer and fall in the Adirondacks, the rest of the year in New York. And this is one of the works she produced there. But what is interesting about it is a quote that she had made about the time of this painting in one of her letters. She said, "The subject is in you, nature giving only suggestions. The subject is in you." This is the very definition of expressionism. This is expressionism. This is the artist using the object out there as a way of articulating his or her feelings, okay? So these are, yes, they are abstractions of nature, but they are also expression. They are also personal expressions. The subject is in you. The subject is in me. Now, she hated the Adirondacks. She did not like the Adirondacks. It did not suit her temperament, her tastes. At one point, she described the Adirondacks as little. She said, it's so damn little. Little lives, little scenery. Which explains what happens in 1929. In 1929, she had lived for 2 years out west in Amarillo, and she loved the landscape of West Texas. And she really longed to get back to it. In 1929, she and a friend of hers took a trip out west. And between 1929 and 1949, this was the beginning of her change of schedule. Between 29 and 49, she spent every summer and early fall in New Mexico. So instead of going up to the Adirondacks with Alfred, she went out west. She had tried to encourage Alfred to come out west, but Alfred refused. Alfred never, ever went out west. And this was a cause of considerable bitterness to her, and one of the many reasons that by the end of their marriage, they had really kind of fallen apart. There were other reasons as well, but I won't go into them all. So anyway, so she spends every summer and early falls out in New Mexico. From 1949 to her death at the age of 98 in 1986, she's out there permanently. And this as a result of the fact that in 1946 he dies, and it takes her, she is the executor of his estate, and it literally takes her a couple of years to get all of that straightened out before she can, in fact, move out permanently. But anyway, so basically from 1929 to her death, what she's painting is that landscape, that beautiful New Mexico landscape, like this. And as you can see, these are abstractions. They're simplifications, okay? They're formal simplifications meant to give you the essence of that place. And this one in particular is one that I particularly like, Road Past the View. And as you can see, the process of simplification, but you can also see the degree to which it's precisely the same shapes that she had found in her head in 1916. The similarities between these two works, formal similarities between these two works, is compelling. And again, telling us that really why does she go out west? She goes out west because it's the shape in her. It's the landscape in her. It is her landscape. Now, why do we love them? We love them because they provide an escape. We love them because they provide an antidote to qualities of modern life, to qualities of confusion, noise, overly complex lives that we have, okay? And these works stand in a long tradition of modern landscape paintings that provide us a wonderful bit of quietude, simplicity, clarity, all of the things that are missing from modern life. Now, there's no doubt that she loved these landscapes for precisely that reason as well. But what I want to argue, what I have been arguing, is that she does so not simply because, should I smile? I really, as my wife will tell you, I hate having pictures being taken. I'm sorry, honey. I'm sorry. Anyway. And there's no doubt that she loves it as well, but what I want to argue is that it's more than that, okay? That what she finds in that landscape are the qualities that she's had within her or is developing within her. And I think in some ways that's one of the reasons we love her work, is because what we see in this work is not only an escape for ourselves, but we see as Georgia O'Keeffe herself. We see the qualities of her, the clarity, the simplicity, the grace, the strength, okay? I love this picture because it really says something about, I think, it articulates something that we all know and feel. That in a way there is a kind of identification between Georgia O'Keeffe and her work. When we see her work, we see her. When we see her work. In a very, very special way, in a very special sense. Many of these have also been identified as sexual, having something of the sexuality of her early works. A work like this, Black Place, reminds us of those very sexualized or very sexually images of flowers. A work like this, again, very curvilinear, okay, very bodily, and it has been argued by at least one art historian that what we're looking at here is homologies for the felt experience of the female body, that she's identifying herself with this place, and her sexuality is embodied in this particular landscape and being expressed through the landscape, her sexuality. Not that the landscape is sexual, the landscape isn't particularly sexual, but that she's using the landscape to express her own sexuality. That's the point I want to make. Now, the identification of the woman, with the landscape is a very old tradition. And it's a tradition to which many women have, for years and years, especially feminists, have objected. This notion that the woman as passive, simply there for the uses of the male, okay? That she is here for us to use. But I think there's a very fundamental difference between an image by a man of a woman as landscape and an image by a woman of a landscape. Because I think what we're looking at here is in the work on the right, we're looking at from a male point of view, and we're looking at the other. The work on the left, she is looking at that landscape in terms of an identification with herself. Okay? And it's not an image for a male viewer. It's not an image for the male. It's an image of herself, an image of the qualities of herself, the image of grace, strength, beauty, the images that we see in herself. So that what we really see here is, yes, abstract expressionism. Thank you. And we do have time for questions. If anybody needs to leave, by all means. And if you don't need to leave, hello, John.
For those of us who are docents, I hate to tell you, we needed this 3 months ago. Very good.
Sorry. You got a couple weeks left, John. Okay. Yes, sir.
Are you the first person to label the work as being abstract expressionist?
I believe I am.
Okay, because I've never actually seen a label with her work. And another question that I might have for you, or that I do have for you actually, is the Bird in Flight by Kandinsky.
Yeah.
As you know, there was a very famous lawsuit about that.
Yes.
Could you please give us some information about that? I have read about it.
Okay. Well, the Brancusi. I mean, the Brancusi was in the show. The Brancusi was in the show with Duchamp. Okay. One of the interesting things about that is that Duchamp, as many of you know, partly as a result of the fame that was created by his work in the Armory show, he became famous in America. And in 1916 or 1915, I think it is, he actually moved here during World War I. He moved here because he had to work here. He couldn't go in the army. I know this is maybe longer than you want, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. He couldn't go in the army because he had a bad heart, okay? But he looked healthy. And during the war, healthy young men walking around the streets of Paris or anywhere in France were insulted. Why aren't you in the war? You're a coward. They were called cowards. And so he said, I got tired of being a coward, so I moved to New York, where I was well known already, okay? And in New York, he supported himself largely. One of the ways he supported himself was as a dealer in Brancusis. He sold Brancusis. He collected them and sold Brancusis. And at one point, a group of the Brancusis came to the United States, and the customs people said they weren't art. They said, because if it's art, you don't have to pay a custom on it. And they said, like words like the Bird in Flight, they said, no, it's just copper. I mean, it's bronze. It's just bronze. So they wanted to charge him for bronze. Okay, and so it became it became a very famous case of the customs people saying it's not art. But that's the point. The point is that Duchamp was bringing these Brancusis into the country. So Brancusi was better known here in New York as a result of Duchamp than he was in Europe.
But the judge ruled that it was art.
That it was art.
And
Yeah.
it's almost 100 years ago. That's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
phenomenal.
and which is phenomenal. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes.
You showed us one example of a pair of images where one of her early shapes was seen again in
Right.
her later work.
Right.
I think the early shape was from 1960.
Was here from here. Right.
In general, though, do you agree with the thesis of the previous speaker that
Hartley.
the shapes
Mr. Hartley. Yeah, I do agree, and I really do, because what is one of the interesting things about her work is how little development there is. When you look at most artists' work, what you find is development. You find a whole period of trial and error, and then trying this, and then trying that, and eventually they'll get somewhere. Okay, Hopper. I mean, Hopper doesn't find Hopper until 1925. You know, he's in 1908. It takes him almost 20 years to figure out who I am and what I want to do. And that is true of most artists, okay? What you find is development. You really don't find development in her work. And that's his point. His point was that the shapes she's using in 1916, there they are, repeated. Once she finds it, and again, my thesis is that she found the shapes and then found the landscape. Okay, that suited the shapes. She doesn't find the landscape and then find the shapes. The shapes are already there, and that's the interesting thing. Thank you for nodding your head. Quite often I get. Yes?
I was wondering, if her last 20, 25 years, she was blind.
Yeah. Was it that? I don't think it was that long. It was a long time. Yeah, a long time. Yeah.
But anyway, she was assisted by others.
Yeah.
So, with your point that
But she can.
does that mean that someone else may have done the work?
Oh no, because she was continuing to make art with the help of others, but I think he showed some of them. I think Hartley, as I recall, I think Hartley showed some of the late works that she's done with that, and they look like everything else. You know, they got the same basic shapes. They're not as developed and as refined, but they're the same shapes. She's still doing the same thing. They're hers. Oh yeah, they are hers. Yeah. She's getting help, but they're hers. Yeah, I don't think there's any question about, or at least I've not heard there any question on that. Other questions? One of them. Arthur Dove. The Arthur Dove. She did the one on the right. She did the one on the right. The one on the left was by Arthur Dove. I don't know if I can get it back. Let me see. Yes, I can. Is that the one you're talking about? The one on the left there? The one on the left is by Arthur Dove. The one on the right is by O'Keeffe. And Dove was a very, very close friend of hers. Do you have a question about this or no? Just yeah. Well, the difference is if you know about Dove is producing not necessarily what he is, but what he likes. And again, this is an interesting distinction, okay, between it really is a question of why do we like what we like? And again, maybe the great contemplation that I want to leave you with is why do you like what you like? Do you like what you like because it complements you and provides you with something of, I like women, but I'm not one, okay? They provide a complement, okay? Do you like what you like because it complements you and balances you out in some way? Or do you like what you like because it is you? And that's the question. And that's not always an easy thing to differentiate. You know, it is a continuity, right? Where's the line? But it's a useful contemplation. And on that note, I will send you all on your way. Thank you very much.